Good evening, TDP cohort. Welcome back from your Eid break. I hope you guys had a really wonderful Ramadan and a fantastic Eid and got to spend some quality time around some close friends and family and are coming back feeling renewed and refreshed. This is my last session with you guys, sad to say, so I hope to make it a good one. And the goal of this video is really just to build a foundation in your mind about what to expect when you're thinking about data. There's no way that in a single video or in a single week we could really do a deep dive in all the different complexities, but this will at least give you a fundamental understanding from which you can start building a better concept of what data looks like and how to use it as you move forward in your own teaching journey and your own teaching practice. So let's jump into it. I'm going to start out with just recapping some of the scope of assessment that we've already gone through over the course of these lessons so that we can see how data fits into this. So we talked about designing and implementing assessment, and we talked about how to use criteria and standards and subject-specific skills and knowledge in order to build our assessments. And we talked about how we use that content and skills list in order to backwards plan our year, unit, and lesson plans. We also talked about in the process of assessing using formative assessment, particularly in the form of checks for understanding in the classroom, in order to monitor your students' daily progress. And we talked about summative assessment and how there are different types of summative assessment. And we talked about how to employ standards and criteria-based performance data when developing rubrics that we'll use to assess students during those assessments. Our focus for today is how to collect and respond to assessment data, and we're going to talk about how to use assessment data to make changes to curriculum, instructional approaches, and expectations for a unit. So that gives you a clear picture of kind of where we were and where we are and where we're about to be by the end of this lesson. And you can just kind of reflect on that and see how these different pieces fit together. So this is our big takeaway for this particular lesson today, which is that all of our decisions about curriculum, instruction, differentiation, and intervention need to be driven by data. I don't want you to be intimidated by this idea of being driven by data. When we talk about data, all we're talking about really is all the information that you can possibly collect about students and their performance and their learning styles and what works for students and what doesn't in the classroom. We need to make all of our decisions based on information and evidence and not just based on our own personal experiences or our own personal biases. Everything we're going to talk about around data falls into two buckets. The first one has to do with student achievement data. And we're going to think about student data around academic performance and student behavior, and also response to intervention for those students that need some sort of differentiation. After that, we're going to talk about curriculum effectiveness data. How do we use data in order to think about what worked in our units, in our lessons, and in our year plan? Are there any gaps or things that we need to go back and make better? So those are the two areas, and let's jump into the student achievement data section first. When we're thinking about student achievement data, the thing that automatically pops into mind is what can students do? What are their grades? What are their scores on the criteria and the standards? That's the very traditional concept of marks and scores that we grew up with. The other type of data that we need to collect on students is not quite as obvious, but it becomes pretty apparent once you're in a classroom, and that is how are students behaving. Now, when I use the word behaving, it's really important that you understand something, and that is that learning is a behavior. I'm going to say that one more time. Learning is a behavior. And when you are teaching in the classroom, you are teaching content, that's true, but you also have to teach students the behaviors associated with learning. What are the behaviors that learning people demonstrate? When we're talking about the MYP or the PYP, that's going to link up to what we call the ATLs, which are the approaches to learning. So those are the learning behaviors that the PYP and MYP have identified. And then we also want to think about how students are behaving when it comes to socio-emotional skills. How are they interacting with one another? How are they communicating with one another? How are they conducting themselves, and are they conducting themselves appropriately in a classroom? And lastly, but certainly not least, we want to think about response to intervention. Response to intervention has to do with students that are having learning difficulties. Whenever you have a student that is difficult to reach or has a specific type of learning disability, then you are going to have to differentiate in the classroom for that student. And you need to keep good records of the types of differentiation that you're using. That way you can look back at those notes and see what really works for that student and how you can craft better plans in the future that'll help them learn. So that takes care of all the things that we need to collect data on when we're thinking about student achievement. But we also need to understand there's a lot of different places we can get this data from. There are standardized versus non-standardized tools, and there are internal versus external tools. That's going to leave us with kind of three buckets that we can collect information from. We can collect internally standardized information. That's going to be assessment data from common assessments, from assessments that we give across the entire grade level in a subject. And anytime we give one of those assessments, the teachers are supposed to come together and look at all the different student scores so that all the teachers have the same frame of reference when they're marking those assessments and when they're thinking about how students achieve based on the work that they produced. Another bucket of information is externally standardized data. So that's going to come from external assessments, things like MAP testing or the MYP exam. Externally standardized data is helpful because it gives you information that's been benchmarked against other students in other schools around the world, not just within our own school. And that's important because sometimes within a school, you can kind of get a little bit of tunnel vision and you'll start to think, wow, these students are really doing awesome. And then students take some sort of standardized test and they score really low. And then the last type of data is the internal assessment data. Internal assessment data tends to be the most subjective, but it's also really important to your own practice. The internal assessment data is all of the information that you collect in your classroom that's not standardized against other teachers teaching the same thing. Because we have these three different types of data that we're collecting, we're going to have a lot of different platforms from which to collect that data. We may put our own classroom scores on a spreadsheet in Google Drive. We'll have MAP scores available from the NWEA. We have PowerSchool, where we keep a lot of our common assessment data. We have Google Classroom, where you can score students on the Google platform there and automatically create spreadsheets that show you how students are doing across assignments. We use ManageBack in order to provide PYP, MYP, and IB assessment information. And we use Tableau in order to consolidate a lot of this information and look at different ways of visualizing it. Each one of these platforms gives you some sort of data from one of these sources. And once we learn how to use these different types of information in order to look at all the different aspects of student achievement, then we'll really be able to adapt our teaching in order to meet students' needs. And that brings us to this second area, which has to do with curriculum effectiveness data. When we're thinking about our lesson, unit, and year plans, what do we need to keep? What do we need to change? And what should we throw out? Curriculum reflections are super important to do with your teaching team. That's one of the reasons why ManageBack has a platform in it for you to do curriculum reflections, but it may be helpful for your team to also have your own reflection document that you can look back on and that has a little bit higher level of accessibility for you. Once you get together with your team and you talk about what worked in a unit and which lessons were really super effective and which lessons weren't, and how certain lessons could be changed in order to become more effective, then it's going to be important for you to look back on the content and skills that you developed at the very beginning of the planning cycle and to make changes according to student needs. And then, of course, those changes are going to need to spill over to your backwards planning. And then you need to think again about how your lesson sequence and how the process of the unit and the scope of the unit contributed to the learning at the end of the unit. So just to recap, when we're thinking about data around assessment, we want to think about data that both lets us know where students are in multiple areas, and we want to think about data in terms of our own teaching in our own units and whether or not we are being effective. And that gets back to our key takeaway for this particular lesson, which is that all of our decisions about curriculum, instruction, differentiation, and intervention need to be driven by data. So hopefully that information will create a little bit of a foundation for you on how to think about and conceptualize the different types of data that you're getting in the classroom and what you need to be doing with that data and what's important about it. So I just want to say that it's been a pleasure teaching you guys Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed developing these videos and developing these lesson resources for you guys. I wish you all the best in the future. And please feel free to reach out to me if ever you have any questions along your teaching journey that you think I could be helpful for. Thanks so much, and take care.